if you'll forgive the phrase, is a mouth-watering one. Shobha Narayan traveled through India to explore the world of prasadams, or prasads as we call it in some parts of the country. These are our food offerings to the gods in our puja. Shobha will discuss a book, Food and Faith, A Pilgrim's Journey Through India, with well-known social entrepreneur and educationist Deepa Krishnan. At the end of the conversation, there's a Q&A, so do send in your questions and we'll put them to the author. So now I'm handing over to both of you. Deepa, Shobha, there you are.
Take it away.
Before we start the conversation, can we look at the book? Show our viewers the cover at least. There you go.
It's a lovely cover too. Very nice illustrations. I loved it.
In fact, one immediate response I got to my mailer was, it's such a wonderful subject. I hope there are nice illustrations inside.
Well, the book is illustration free. It's just text. And, you know, Anil, this kind of book can be made into a coffee table book or it can be a book. Yeah. And I like the book because I think it then lets my imagination, you know, go. It's, you know, when I first read Rowling, when I first read Tolkien, it was my imagination that filled all the gaps. And I think photographs ruin it, to be honest. I like it.
Absolutely right. So I'm going to leave you to talk and I'll be listening in. See you.
Thank you, Anil. So, hi everyone, I'm Deepa and Shobha and I are old friends. We've met many years ago when Shobha was exploring Mumbai and we just hit it off. And we also come from the same community, so I totally get some of the stuff that she says in this book. And if you haven't read the book, it's really wonderful. It's Shobha's journey, starting as a skeptic, although coming from a family of believers, she starts out a skeptic. And it's a journey through India, through not just temples, but dargahs, through a gurudwara. She goes to Nepal in search of the goddess. And it's her personal journey. So I liked it because it was like reading something about a friend and her exploration, and we are also roughly the same age, so it's, you know, there's much to learn from another person's journey, and I personally love the book and I'm really looking forward to talking about it. Shobha, what set you off on this in this journey?
Yes, well, like all of us, I grew up eating prasadams, and one of the responses to this, as you know, Deepa, was walking on Mumbai during Ganapati festival and eating all the modaks at different places. And every pilgrimage site in India has a prasadam. I think it's God's way or the temple designer's way of ensuring people show up, because they will come and they will eat a bundi laddu, panchamritam or anything. So I started my book writing career as a food writer. And so about 15 years ago, when I was living in New York, Kamini Mahadevan, who was then an editor in Penguin, took me out for coffee in Manhattan and said, I read your first book, Monsoon Diary, and it's about food. Why don't we do a food book together called Sacred Food? And it will be about prasad, and you will travel to all the different places. So that was that. And then she left, and then I moved continents. I moved to Singapore and then to India, and we parked the book. And meanwhile, somebody else wrote Sacred Food about about foods in the West. So then 2 years ago, I pitched Sukumar, who is my editor at Mint, and I said, why don't I at least start writing for you about this? And that's what began this. So it was a gift from the universe.
So a couple of these I read in the Mint as well, I think. I remember reading your dosa. The
Yes.
Aragar Koil dosa was in Mint. For those who don't know, one of the chapters in this is devoted to a temple in Madurai. Shobha, tell us about that temple. Shobha's writing is all, it's like a travelogue, and there's food and there's her own journey. And even for someone like me who's an Indophile and, sort of a professed reader of books on Indian history and so on and so forth, there's so much to discover in Shobha's book. So tell us about that dosai.
So I went to Madurai to see Meenakshi, and she of the green hue, she the warrior princess, and as a feminist, she attracts me. Even though she sort of cocked out and married Shiva in the end, and it became all demure and dainty, but I went to her to see the warrior princess, and I went there and I visited the temple, and then somebody said, this prasadam is okay, but to eat a really good prasadam, you have to go outside Madurai to this Aragar Kovil. Now, Aragar means handsome lord, and Aragar Kovil is literally handsome lord of the universe, basically. I said, okay, he's modest too. So I went to this temple, and I had the best, for all the prasad in this, or prasadams in the book, this was my favorite, because for one thing, it was savory. And the second thing, it uses Vigna Mungo, which is the black urad dal native to India, instead of now, even in all our South Indian households, we use the white urad. So this is the old recipe, and they deep fry it in ghee. So you can
So how does one deep fry a dosa? I had a hard time picturing that, Shobha.
It's actually like a vade. Even though they call it a dosa, it's actually a vade. Aragar Kovil dosai, they say, but it's the size of a vade. And my God, you eat one, it's like those Hanumar vades, a little bit bigger. And it was fantastic. And that whole experience of watching a priest, I've never seen a priest dress up. And that I got to do in this temple, because I'm chasing this priest all day to find out about the temple, and he is spinning, and there's a VIP who wants special darshan. There are, he has to get ready for the evening urbalam around the village. Finally, he says, you come at 6 o'clock before the evening worship, and I go. It's an adjoining chamber next to the sanctum sanctorum, and I have a video of this, and he's doing his he's dressing up. He's putting all the white sacred ash and everything. And as he dresses up, he tells me about the temple. And then we have dinner together.
I think it's a bucket list item.
You would have loved it.
For me, because I love textiles so much. It's all about, like, I'm thinking about, what was he wearing? Was he wearing those gorgeous cottons, with the two contrast borders? That's where my brain is going.
Yes.
But I love that. I love that chapter in this. Shobha, I'm very curious because so I'm also an aspiring writer, right? Who isn't? Everybody wants to write a book. So my question to you is, when you write, who do you imagine? Who are you writing for? This book particularly, it made sense to me as an Indian, and I think it would make sense to a lot of non-Indians as well. Who are you writing for?
So I'm writing for you and Anil and Amy. I think you and Sahil, you would be I'm writing for, so if you permit me, I will read one page about the kind of person I'm writing for, and it's the conclusion, and it's one page. It won't take very long. And I say, when I began this journey, it seemed like a simple, fairly obvious exercise. You travel to temples, eat good food, and make peace with your fate. What I hadn't bargained for was how my faith would touch me, the questions it would raise and answer. Hinduism is a vast, magnificent religion, deep and mysterious, compassionate and complex. Religion is an inheritance and a choice. I was born a Hindu, and I like the religion enough not to choose another. But being a proud Hindu is something that I wriggle away from. In Goa, a Hindu member of parliament once told me that he was a proud Hindu within the confines of his home, but outside he was an Indian first and a Hindu last. That sounds about right to me. So then I talk about where I live in the cantonment area of Bangalore, which has people of all faiths. And I say we may pray to Jesus, Rama, or Allah, but at the end of the day, we are all children of God. We have many identities. We are son, daughter, spouse, sibling, friend, and professional. I tend to identify myself through my work, and I would suspect most readers of the book are the same way. I'm attracted to the beauty of Hindu rituals, to the pomp and circumstance. I like Christian gospel music, Buddhist philosophy, Sufi poetry, Jewish literature, Sikh generosity, Parsi identity. And in India, we are lucky enough to experience all of them. So yes, I'm a Hindu. I like my faith, but please, that's not all I am. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have a fridge full of prasadams that I need to eat. So so I'm writing for you. I'm writing for the modern Indian who wants to be a believer. And, but that's not, the entire identity is not that of a believer.
It is problematic. We are in a problematic era where the world, if we are to believe the mythology, it is Kali Yuga, and things are not hunky-dory. And I like your journey, Shobha, because you start out questioning, asking. You are skeptical about the money grabbing, and you make no bones about saying so clearly, you know, that there is this whole gross
hypocrisy.
Yeah, you know, that side to the temples, and also all this bargaining with God for favors. How did you get past that and see beyond that? That's my stumbling block.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I'm past that, Deepa. I think it behooves. I think everybody should have some sort of faith. That much I'm clear. So I've gone from being atheist to agnostic to now saying I want to be a believer. So I'm on my way there. I think, you know, there was a Time magazine story a long time ago, and the cover story was about faith, and it said, the faithful have better marriages, they lead longer lives, and they're calmer, and blood pressure is down. I'm like, man, I wish I could be like that. So I think faith is important. I think I think India is one of the few countries where it's possible to be faithful and also see the contradictions. So this Romanian scholar called Mircea Eliade coined this phrase, the sacred and the profane. And he talks about how if you go to Greece or Egypt, which had as fantastic mythologies as all of us, you don't see Osiris walking on the road. You don't see Athena in Greece walking on the road. But in Hindu mythology, you still see Ganesha at the corner of the road. You see in Karnataka, you see people who do this hulivesha. They paint themselves like tigers. So all the ancient ways in which humankind connected with God, which is animism, thinking of yourself as animism, as animals, you see that in hulivesha. Sacred groves and trees, again, the fetishes. Hunter would go see one particular tree, catch an animal and say, okay, that tree is sacred. We still have that in India. And I think that the pagan religions, the animism, the fetishism, then the sort of the organized faiths, it's all there. It's just wonderful that it's available to us, and we need to discover it. So to answer your question, I see the virtue of being a believer, and I hope I'll get there by the next book.
No, I think what I'm hearing from you is that we need to pick and choose. These days, I work with a lot of tribal communities close to Mumbai, and that is actually very powerfully appealing to me, because for them it is, and I see it, I see it in their attitude, the respect, it's not even respect. Recently I saw a Warli painting in which there's a whole scene. This is the people of the mountain, okay? It's a mountainous area that I work in. And the artist depicted people, mountain, tiger, blah, blah, blah. And the people are tiny. So it is a worldview where you are there and you are part of many things. The world was depicted, both the sky, the creatures in the sky, the creatures under the soil, and among them humans as just one aspect. So that kind of thinking appeals to me, but I think that in India we are losing the diversity, and
You,
that we are.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that we are moving towards a monotheistic sort of big, single view of things. What's your view on that?
I was going to actually pay you a compliment. I was going to say, you told me, Deepa, when I told you I'm going to Orissa, and both of us love textiles and crafts. And I'll never forget. I wish I had put it in the book, actually. You said Orissa is how India used to be or should be, because it's still, you see and the counter to that from my husband was, that's because the economy hasn't taken off. Because if the economy takes off, all the stuff that you and I love, the traditional arts, the tribal faiths, it'll all be gone. And in Jagannath Puri temple, I saw outside the Orissa that you and I love, which is the women wearing the saris in the traditional style, a very earthy sense of who they are. Right? Very, very casual, but very authentic. But then you go into the Jagannath Puri temple and all the things you alluded, all the things you alluded,
I like you, and
sorry, I'll just finish. All the things you alluded to in your earlier question, Deepa, about the priests. So you go to inside the Jagannath Puri temple, and the first thing somebody will tell you is, don't let the pandas get to you, because they will take you by hand and they will make you their own kind of thing. So, but the myths surrounding that temple are fantastic. So then you have to have that, and then you have to deal with the worldly aspect of it. But please, please.
No, I loved your chapter on Puri. But I didn't know all the Puri Mahatmya and the fact that Puri is claimed by so many religions, and I didn't know all of that. And I consider myself fairly well read on these things. So I loved it. I loved the entire chapter. And my memories of Puri are also food memories. I went into the kitchen of that. They won't let you into Jagannath, yes, of course. But the other temple that you alluded to, I too went there. And
I think it's
fascinating that just looking at those earthen pots and things cooking in that, and all this old style melons and things like that. It's just and men in dhotis. Let's not forget the textile of that, the visual of that. Is stunning. Smoky, dark sort of place, and these men cooking, just fantastic. And you brought that out, and you brought that memory out for me in the book. I also love that you went so many places with your mom. Auntie must have had a blast. She must have loved it.
She was, I don't know, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I was Mr. Hyde and she was Dr. Jekyll. So I was everything she said, this commentary would go in my head. But one thing we both agreed on, which is in Puri, Deepa, there's a poem there in that chapter, which I quoted from another book, where it talks about Vishnu and his consort, and he's looking at his consort through liquor-addled eyes and touching her breasts on which there is musk paste. And I'm thinking, where did we go from there to this
modern day prudery?
Prudery, yeah. So the literature around Puri too was pretty stunning.
No, that whole Gita Govind, which you allude to, is rich with that kind of metaphor. And we see even in, I liked your writing on the Dargah at Ajmer as well. You talk about this love, the mention of the beloved, which is there. Your book is fantastic, Shobha. It goes all over. It sees all, I was, so for those who don't know, I run a travel company, and I was thinking that I should take out chapters from this and give it to my guides and say, you better read all this about your own city. Wonderful, wonderful. Ajmer especially.
Give some copies, give the whole book. What sari are you wearing? I've been stupidly staring at it.
I went into some shop and totally ransacked 6 meters of material, and I'm wearing I think this is woven in Andhra Pradesh and in Srikakulam, and it's just Andhra cotton. and it's fabulous. What texture?
Rama will be proud of you.
Who? Rama Bijapurkar?
No, Uzrama. Uzra will
Rama.
be.
Yes, Uzrama will be proud.
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you was, the difference between you and me is I did not grow up in a ritual-based household. Like there were no prayers. And, when I read about Achamanam in the book, I had to actually Google and look at a video to see how it's done because I've never done it and I've never seen it done. And so I grew up without that. And so my journey is different from yours. So do you think it's just your childhood conditioning that is pushing you in a certain direction?
So I am leery of God, men. With that caveat, let me say one thing that one person who I met in Haridwar, his name is Swami Avdeshananda, and he runs the biggest matha, we call it in South India, but the ashram in Kankal in Haridwar. And I went just to research the book and I met him and I asked him, and he was doing a puja. And what he did was he went to the sacred people tree, he put his head on it, and then he did the achamanam, all the flowers and everything. And I said, what is the value of puja? Why are you doing this? He said, when you touch nature, when you touch flowers, when you use water, when you use fire as a way to invoke the gods, how can you be separate from the universe? How can you be separate? So that sort of makes sense. I think rituals and Hindu rituals and every faith, I think, figured out a way to make the visceral into the ritual. And we can think of God in a very visceral way, but rituals anchor us in the earth. And if anything, I'm an earth worshipper. So I like the fact that a French perfumer told me that he wished he didn't make perfumes, wished he made incense. And I thought he was being sort of gratuitous because I'm from India and incense and everything. He said, no, smoke is the oldest way that we reach God in every culture. And so incense, yeah. So I like rituals. I like the beauty of rituals. I like the grace of it. I like the fact that you go into Christmas is coming and we go for midnight mass, and I have problems with every faith, but I like the music and the ritual of it. So
yeah, the music is it brings you to tears, Shobha. There are places in your book where I was tearing up, and it is certain phrases. They are triggers, they just trigger, because you have heard devotees say those chants, and somewhere in your blood, all that is there. So one is responding quite viscerally to all this stuff, which is why I think that it's a lot of brainwashing. It's a lot of, all of these sounds, these smells, they're all inside us. So it stirs up the blood.
I teared up in Ajmer because there was a Qawwali group singing. And I've never been to Ajmer. In fact, it doesn't loom large in my imagination like perhaps it does for you, Deepa, because if you grow up in Chennai, you don't hear too much about North Indian temples. And so I had no idea. And I went there and I love Desi Gulab and it's everywhere. And you would love it too. The bamboo baskets that people carry in, it's just, and look at the design. It's like a mandala. You have the Desi Gulab and the marigold and everybody takes it in. And so first of all, your senses are suffused with this fragrance, and then you go there and then there are people and they just sit and they listen to the Qawwali and the plaintive voices of these Qawwali singers reaching out to God. And then once you go inside the dargah, it's the same. Hurry up, madam, do this, quickly go around. Do you want this? Come to one side. So it's the same.
I also think, Shobha, that once you accept the intermediary, so there are all these hustlers, right, everywhere. They want to make that little buck. Sometimes I think you should just accept it and not fight it. So everything doesn't have to be fought. It's okay, let them make their living. They help you through the process. They're also earning. Sometimes I really feel like that. And I think I'm becoming more tolerant, if anything, as I grow older. Anil, are you there? I was looking for audience questions if there are any. And if there aren't, then we'd like to invite people to ask whatever they have. I'm not able to look it up on my phone.
Deepak, there are questions, but you still have time. I suggest you...
That's okay. We'll do some questions and then we'll go back to chatting. Do you want to pick some? You want to pick a couple for Shobha?
Okay, they're coming. They're coming to you on your WhatsApp. Okay, while you wait, I'll ask Shobha, which was the most delicious prasadam you had in your journey?
So besides the Ayagar Kovil dosa with which Anil, if you ever go to Madurai, you should make a trip to visit and eat. Of course, the Harmandir the langar in Amritsar. It wasn't delicious, but it was unforgettable. It was first of all in modest environment and created by a community for a community, and a religion that has a book at the center of it. So what's not to like? The Granth, you go in and I'm like, wow, a religion that worships a book, I'm for this. And I had a funny experience outside because there was this family where the father and the son were having, the son in an American accent and the father clearly Indian. They live in America and they were having this interchange, which I had been having with my mother the whole time. And the son was like, God is everywhere. Why are we here? I can worship God from my video game chamber or something. But yeah, that was the most delicious one.
Okay, I think you got questions there. You're muted,
Yeah.
Deepa.
I have a very okay.
Now you're not.
How did I do
You're
that?
fine, you're fine.
I'm okay. I have an interesting question from Annette Rodriguez, and she asks, why is food so important to Indian religions? You don't see much of it in other great religions of the world, at least not during the rituals, unless you include the communion wafer as a prasad, which it is not. It's more like celebrating a point. So basically, yeah, that's the question around why food is so central to Indian food sacred experience.
That's a great question, and I've thought about it. You know, there are two, in my opinion, there are two civilizations that are ancient and food centric. Every civilization will say they are it, but in my view, India and China are it, because Greek civilization as it is today does not, the trickle down has been so little. China, for whatever reason, has given up its connection to the faith, whereas India has maintained the food and faith connection, which is why I think in India, the way it's translated, so Latin America, Annette, you go there and you have the spectacle where the Christianity as it is celebrated in Latin America is, you have the parades and but not much food. Whereas here, I wanted to include Christianity, and it was very gratuitous because in Bangalore, the biggest Christian festival is down the road from my house, and it's called the Feast of Mother Mary. And I said, this is a feast. It can be perfect for the book, but as she says, the Feast of Mother Mary,
there is no feast.
It isn't about the food, but as Annette pointed out, every other faith, food is linked because China gave it up.
Yeah. You're saying China used to have it, huh?
No, I am saying two great food civilizations are India and China. China decided not to connect its food with its faith, first of all, and India decided to millennia ago. And so we still have that. But so the reason I think food is central Go ahead.
No, I was thinking, Shobna, also perhaps because it is not an orchestrated service. Like it's something where different people are coming in and going out at different times. So you take away something, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess if you had a single service and everyone was in it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just hypothesizing. There's no reason. I don't think there's any real answer to this question.
It's a holistic view of the world that I think. It's a holistic view of the world because we have our aesthetics are there in Hindu faith, certainly in the decorations. The notion of alankara was explained to me as more is more, where you decorate with not an inch left. So the Indian aesthetics are there. Then the sensuality of the smells. Of course, food would be a natural. So if you do the Panchabhuta, the food would be there as well.
So another question, and this one's from Riddhi Agarwal, and she says, are there any sacred ingredients common that you kept, bumping into as you went? Are they common across temples, across India?
I mean, sadly, our rivers are no longer thus, but water was sacred across all faiths. Every faith, you go to the, I went to a family, you set me up with the family in Mumbai. I went to their house. Every faith has water linked as a sacred thing. Not even trees or fruits or any. I mean, you would think that there are sacred trees. Water is universal. And
I would put ghee out there, Shobha.
Huh?
Ghee.
Now it's a, yeah. Now what's all these Hollywood celebrities are guzzling it down. So ghee is.
No, so I think prasadam, if you want to look at prasad and what's common across cultures, Indian, across communities in India, then I would think ghee rates right on top. Milk is offered in different ways, right?
Yeah.
Hotel.
Okay, so if you're asking for ingredients, okay,
yeah, that was the question.
Milk would be high, because even the halwa that was made at the Jewish halwa that is made is flavored with coconut milk. That's how it is different, and it tastes a lot better. Christianity, I don't know the role of milk, whether it is, but milk and bread, I guess, or milk and grain of some sort. So yeah, sacred ingredient across all faiths. Islam,
not necessarily across all faiths, but by and large seen in temples.
Yeah. The Kesariya Baat at the Ajmer Dargah is the typical broken wheat, and then the sugar and the ghee 1:2. Yeah.
So also, Riddhi wants to know why Sheera is so ubiquitous.
Sheera, I beg to say that in South India it is not. It is perhaps ubiquitous in North India, but Sheera is kesari, na? What we call kesari.
Yes, made of rava.
Yeah. So the Kesariya Baat in Ajmer has that broken wheat. Yes. But if you come to South India, whether it is much more rice based. So the Kerala temple payasam is rice, milk, and sugar. All reduced to like 1/5 of its quantity. In Payani, the Panchamritam is the Panchamrit, which is the country sugar, the Kalkand, which is rock candy. Then we have the bananas, and then so it has. So Sheera is not ubiquitous in South India.
But I think one possible explanation for it's just that it's wheat derivative, number one, and number two, it cooks really faster. You just cook it in a jiffy, and if you want to make a large amount, then it's really easy to make.
Yeah.
So, Shobha, I was very curious. What led you to Nepal, of all places? Was it your mother's influence?
No. I was a friend of mine. His name is Veer Singh. He runs a lovely place called Bana in Dehradun. And his guru is a Rinpoche, a Nepalese master. So he said, Rinpoche is making a film. Why don't you go and see it? So I went to see the film. And but this Dakini is a rock star Nepal, you still have the Chinnamasta, which my friend Madhu Natraj, who's a dancer here, and I asked her, who's your favorite goddess? One of the people she mentioned was Chinnamasta, because literally she's dancing on a copulating couple, cuts off her hair and blood is spurting out. I'm like, this is like that woman who wrote Gone Girl, Gillian something, where she embraces, our goddesses embrace the dark side, the Kali and the Chinnamasta, the yoginis of Orissa. They are not sanitized. So and there I met this Dakini, and the Rinpoche tells me we all have Dakinis in our universe. You just have to find them. And the way you cultivate this inner consciousness towards a Dakini is you go give a gift to a feminine energy. It can even be a dog. you go offer something, like you're offering a Nevedyam. So prasad is, so what we offer as Nevedyam becomes prasad after the God blesses it. So he said, you go offer this to a Dakini and you say, you are my queen forever and ever. And I couldn't quite manage it, but that was Nepal.
So how did you figure out what to pick and what to drop? Like, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the Northeast.
Yeah. So I really love the Northeast because I'm a birder, but the temple, the temple in Assam has the goddess's cloth as a prasad. So I didn't go there. I wanted to include a Jain temple and perhaps the Sukri Prasad at a Jain temple. It's called, I think, the Mahdi temple. And next time I'll have to do it.
You know, in your book, you talk a lot about this apparent contradiction, and that's also come in one of the questions, where Sujata Palkar says, fasting and denial are the mainstays of Hinduism, yet prasadam encourages us to eat. Isn't that a contradiction? She asks. And you have talked about it in your book, so yes. I will leave this to you to find.
Yeah. Yeah, feasting and fasting, and every matha does this because they do this Chaturmasya Vrata where they eat, every month they eat a different thing, and it sort of also makes sense, which I discovered in the Udupi chapter and in the Puri chapter. So during the monsoon, for example, they will not eat greens because first of all, the insects are all out there. During the Navratri period, they will only eat rice. Again, makes sense because most of the goddesses' offerings are chitra anna or varieties of rice. During Gokulashtami time, they will only eat ghee. They don't give up other things. They will give up grains. So this, call it macrobiotic, call it, you know, eating, all the 5-star chefs say eating local, regional and seasonal. So we did that many millennia ago. And fasting and feasting are like the Paurnami and Amavasya. It's a natural order of things. It makes sense to me somehow. And today, if you go to Shivaji Nagar, I get my flowers from Shafi, who is Muslim, and he will say, Amma, Ekadashi is over. Tomorrow you will get that particular Agati green in that place. So Indians inherently somehow know it regardless of faith, I think.
Shobha, I want to move to what is actually a personal question. And in several places in the book, there are mentions about your family and the younger generation, your daughter, and their reactions to religion. So I think we are all, you know, those of us who are parents, we have a generation above us and one below us, and we are all negotiating this space. I want to hear about your what are you now trying to pass on?
To the, yeah.
Or is it too late?
No. I think faith is important. I think whether so yes, I do Varalakshmi Puja in my house, and the kids I have 2 girls. They are conscripted into it, and they will participate in it. I think. Regardless of whether they end up choosing another. My husband was born a Hindu, but he identifies with Buddhism more than anything else. So I think, but I hear what you're saying. It's very difficult to explain. The best explanation I found, and I say this in the book, is the Jews have figured out how to involve the younger generation, because, for example, they are allowed to participate, whereas in Hindu religions, mostly because we have an intermediary in the priest, we don't speak Sanskrit, we don't understand what they are saying. So I think for starters, if they convert all the priests into speaking either Tamil or Marathi, or that would be a start.
No, also it's very forbidding, right? You say that in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember I curl up in a corner whenever there is anything religious going on. Yeah. I just want to not make mistakes.
Yeah. So the two there were this Swami Avadeshananda, who I mentioned earlier. I think the way to pass it on is to allow them to see the beauty of it and allow them to participate in a way that is not so tense as it always gets in our families. And the second thing is to figure out language. because most faiths are spoken by intermediaries in some ancient tongue. So figure out how they can understand and participate, and just
So
give them.
language, yes. And you also drew that contrast
Yes.
between the communities that you and I come from, which are, Orthodox Brahmin approach to religion versus the abandonment
Yeah.
of singing at the Govind Dev Ji temple in Jaipur. I have been there. All the women with their hands up going,
Yes.
Gopala, Gopala.
Yes.
And we need more of that stuff.
So that is a rock concert of old. See, I Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, I didn't grow up hearing a lot about, but you go to the Calcutta, you go to the parts of the Northeast, there are photos of him are as if he's on hashish. Yeah, basically he's ecstatic. And here in California now, people are taking cannabis to reach that level of. We already had that. We could. But for that, you need to be a believer, Nadeepa. That is why I want to be a believer, to reach that transcendent state without inhaling. But yeah.
A friend of mine described the most transformative experience of his life was getting down at the train station at Banaras. And there was a group of pilgrims singing. They were just sitting on the platform and singing. And he, I think, went and sat with them. And he says he was lost. And he's saying, somewhere in that thing, it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. So it's music. Yeah. That music is in our blood, And even the cadence of Sanskrit is very powerful. I have to, every time I hear certain things, it just hits me. My current sort of hashish is Kumar Gandhar singing a Kabir song, the Chini Chadaria song, which is about who has woven this fabric and with what. And it's the music that it brings tears, it brings goosebumps. And I think our religions have understood this.
Yeah.
And they have used music powerfully.
In the beginning of the Muruga chapter, the Panchampayani chapter, I start by saying Carnegie Hall has nothing on our Indian temples, because you all have to stand there outside waiting. The musician comes, the Oduvar comes, and there are all these old instruments that I found everywhere. In Rajasthan you have, and then the chenda drums in Kerala, the conch blowing, and it's all building up, and then suddenly the curtain opens and then you see the god. So this notion of building up the audience through music, through dance. But you were talking about Kashi. Kashi is extraordinary. Kashi, I think if you go there, there is you literally feel the what Mark Twain said is about Banaras being older than all of them. But the notion of life and death, people go to Kashi to die, and that is very obvious. And what is also obvious is that the way ancient Indians viewed life and death as part of the same cycle is very obvious in Kashi. And somehow, rather than scaring you, this thought of seeing death and being part of your life, and the zest with which people live there, it calms you down and say, you know what, this is part of some great narrative that I am a speck in, and I'm part of the arc of the universe, as Martin Luther King says, extends long, but it always bends towards justice. Well, in Kashi, the arc of the universe, you can literally see that. It's magnificent.
Yeah. And there is something in that river. It draws you. It draws even people like me who are not brought up on a diet of religion at all.
Yeah.
There is something to it.
The Ganga Mata. And I
think it's the collective faith.
Yeah.
To get to Kumbh.
Yeah, Kumbh was wild. It was a wild ride. Because first of all, you have all these foreigners who call themselves swamis and show up with one entourage, and you're thinking,
what is with all of them? I mean, I'm so curious. I'm so curious. Who are these people? Into what akhada are they getting initiated? What are those secret rites? It's all highly, highly interesting.
Yeah. And there was one one Baba, Naga Baba, who was pretty much sans clothes, sans everything, and initiating sort of French followers into the joys, the pleasures of smoking.
So, do you know if Satish Kumar is asking, countries like France and Italy where food is so important, are there any equivalents? Are there is there any religious food, and whether you've heard about it?
So countries like France and Italy are predominantly Christian, and I think that I tried really hard to look for prasad, but albeit only in India. Christianity does not have very obvious feast or prasad connection. Of course, you have you have the bread, and I think you have the wine, but beyond that, no. So there was no prasad or sacred food that I could find when I visited France or Italy.
Rakhi Lalwani is asking. Rakhi is asking. Sorry, are you done?
No, I said hi, Rakhi.
Rakhi is asking. Indians have not popularized temple cuisine when it's so delicious. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Taj, PK Mohan Kumar, who are our mutual friend in Bangalore, told me that one of the things that the Taj group did was send their chefs to various places and learn the temple cuisines, at least in Karnataka, in the Udupi region. So I love hotels, and as a hotelier, how does one popularize temple cuisine is problematic because most of it is simple. And so you have to tell, I think I figured it out. I think the way is to tell the story behind the prasad. That would be it. Because, even Jagannath Puri Bhog, it's Chappan Bhog, and they say the Lord Vishnu bathes in Rameshwaram, comes to Puri to eat, and then goes to Haridwar, Badrinath for meditation and sleeps in Dwaraka. So Puri is the place for food, but the Bhog there is, because it's all ancient vegetables, it's very simple. It is satisfying and simple. So how will a restaurant popularize it? Is somehow you have to link it to the stories. That would be then the connection. Food and faith, the connection would be there. I think that's the way to do it. Which
although Udupi, which you have mentioned is the first chapter, that has become a byword.
Well, masala dosa, but it's not served at the temple now. That's the problem. The temple, Udupi, all over Karnataka, what you must eat, and this is the rasam. The rasam in those temples, it's mainly rice and rasam, and whether it's Dharmasthala or Subramanya or Udupi, it's very simple rice and rasam, but it's so flavorful, so flavorful.
Shobha, I have a slightly difficult question for you, and it's my own question. How did you negotiate this whole caste business while writing the book? It's so difficult, right? So difficult to make this journey and not be cognizant that it is being made from a place of privilege. We are all deeply privileged.
Yes.
To have entry, to have access.
I agree. So Deepa, I'll answer it. The way I could wrap my head around the caste actually came from our common love of textiles. Because as you know, the craftspeople, you go to Kutch or Bhuj, they identify very obviously by their castes, and they call themselves by that, and they say that if you remove that, you're removing our livelihood. So that was one way to make sense of this problematic thing, divisions like that. As far as the temple goes, again, Jagannath Puri is a good example. The Murugan temple in Paini he's a tribal god. The temple, Brahmins are also Ramins in that temple. In contrast to say Aragar Kovil, which is entirely Iyengar and all that whole thing. So I rail about a lot of things, Deepa. Caste is just one of them. I rail about how religions are so patriarchal. I mean, if I get on that list, as you said earlier, I should just move on, the whole notion of...
I think it's a general philosophy for life, Shobha.
So
I was just saying, I think it's a general philosophy for life. We should take what suits us and dump what doesn't. You know?
yes,
One cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater.
agree.
There was a recent discussion that many friends of mine were having around, and this word is in your book as well. You know, the word Tambram, which is a community that both you and I belong to, and even the usage of words like that is highly problematic, because it we are able to use, identify, and easily state it in public, while there are others who cannot, because the communities they belong to do not have that kind of acceptance.
Agreed.
So,
But as with everything in India, all of the above are true. And again, Deepa, you know this. You go to jewelry makers, you go to textile work. The artisans identify by caste entirely. So it is for us. So there is. It's all of the above. As you said, there are some who cannot and who find it painful. There are some who say it with pride. There are some like us who perhaps are bashful and sort of guilty and sheepish about it, don't want to mention it. But then there are also the craftsmen who are, as you say, economically not as privileged as the people who are watching this, but that's who they are. They say that's who they are, and they identify, they separate. The separation of duties, the weaving and the dyeing is done by different castes, and that's how they identify. So that's how I wrap my head around it.
and that came through in your Jewish chapter as well. The fact that the Bene Israelis could find a little niche for themselves. It's a very live and let live, because Indians understood caste and community. Varna, let us say Varna instead of caste. And so the Shanivar Telis could do what they could do.
Correct. And also the Chitpavan friend of mine, who we shall call Rohini, when I told her that they all think they are the same roots as you, she said, well, they can go take a hike because we feel like we descended. So there is all, that chapter was very
I loved your chapter on the Jewish history, and especially the experiences of those Bene Israelis who have gone to Israel.
Yes.
And the fact that there is a caste operating there as well, and that they do face discrimination of some sort or the other.
Yes.
And then the Gora Kala one is also something quite. And of course, it exists in Islam, it exists in Christianity. There is so much of difference on the ground. I mean, the way the religions are practiced on the ground.
I think they feel comfortable in Mumbai more than in Tel Aviv, in Bombay, more than Tel Aviv. I remember in Bombay, I had come to I went to the books. There's a bookstore near Kala Goda where I had gone to listen to an author. I think his name is Martin David. But he was Jewish. He was a Bombay Jew, and he said he had tried living in Israel and always came back.
There's Subodh Patel is asking, is non-vegetarian prasadam offered anywhere, and doesn't that go against religious teachings? So since we're on the subject of caste, this seems to be the right thing to ask.
So yes, non-vegetarian prasadam is offered. And I experienced it in a kind of a rock star kind of way, because there is a fire walking ceremony that happens in Bangalore, and I participated in it. I didn't walk on the fire, next year maybe. But essentially it was brilliant because a man named Bala dressed up in a sari, and on Paurnami days, once a year, the goddess will come into him. And this is a goddess called Angala Parameshwari. She is not Saraswati, Lakshmi, none of that. She's a tribal goddess who predates all of them. And then they go into this, the drums are beaten, they carry a palkodam, which is a pot of milk. They walk around the neighborhood, collect money from Christian, Islam, Hindu merchants, and then they walk on fire. And then by then the fervor has risen so much, it was nothing like nothing. And then there was a whole, on the floor, there was mutton or meat. And this Bala in a sari walked on fire and lifted up like handfuls of red meat, ate it, and gave it to the followers. So yes, there was, but I don't know whether it is, I don't know, I guess it is Hindu. I was going to say,
I've seen many sacrifices
like that.
happens in Maharashtra, it happens in Andhra, it happens pretty much everywhere. There's a alcohol offered to several deities.
Yes.
So these are not in, you know. I have one last question, which is from Anthony Thomas, and he says, food, you know, gourmet wise, which are the 3 best temples to go for prasadams purely from a food angle?
So it is not in this chapter, but I would, let me give you a place rather than a temple. I would say go to Bombay for during the Ganapati festival and have a walking tour in the pandals and sample all the modaks, as you call it. I would say go to Amritsar during a festival, not and have a langar that is a feast. It's larger than it is. I would say that. And in South India, go to Ambalapura and have the pal payasam. Every day it's available. And every day it is dish. And the touching aspect is before they serve the payasam, the man will go out and he'll say, Vasudeva, eat the payasam. And to believe that the God, he has to call a God, that is faith.
Wonderful, no? That calling, that belief and that thing, it's just marvelous. This country of ours, it amazes, delights, makes you cry, all of it at one shot. So that's it from us now. Anil, I'm handing back to you.
Yeah, here I am. We could go on forever listening to both of you. It was a wonderful conversation. And I'm feeling hungry already. So I was saying that as children, I think we look forward to any puja because of the prasadam. And in, as Shobha, you were saying, Ganpati especially, the food is quite delicious, all the modaks, etc. And we look forward to fasting, so-called fasting, because special food was prepared and we ate much more than we did normally. So fasting was a joke, but it was lovely. In closing, let me just ask you, since it's the end of the year and we all love compiling lists, let me ask each one of you to name maybe 1 or 2 or 3 books that you enjoyed in the year. Shobha, I'll start with you.
Okay. So the book that's by my bedside now is M. Krishnan's of Birds and Birdsong. It's a group of essays, and since I'm a birder who aspires to go to the Northeast at some point in her life, I'm reading that. The other book I enjoyed was Arundhati Roy's Ministry of Utmost Happiness. The third book I'm reading is a non-fiction book called Perfumes, and it's A to Z compendium of perfumes.
What about you, Deepa?
I have a haul of books from Orcha. I went to the museum in Orcha, and I have got a whole bunch of books on the sculpture crafts of Orcha. And so that's something I'm reading. And I'm reading a lovely book on Pashmina by Janet Rizvi. So this is what is keeping me.
Well, that's a pretty diverse selection of books from both of you, which, in addition to Shobha's own book, gives a reading list to our viewers. Thank you, Shobha. Thank you, Deepa, for this wonderful conversation. And here's to prasadams.
I would love to hear your list, but I don't know if you're out of time, Anil. You probably have 100.
Well, I have lots, huge lists. And,
yes, indeed.
You know, during the Lit Fest, because I'm on the jury, we get about 40 books, 50 books to read.
What a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Thanks so much again, both of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.